Karen, as well, for inviting me to share some thoughts on community-based natural resource management in disaster risk reduction. I am borrowing some slides that Karen gave me, and I found them good enough. But I wanted to add something. I added something later that I want to highlight. Actually, I don't think I have to tell you a lot about community-based natural resource management and disaster risk reduction, because I'm sure all of you, in one way or another, are working on these or aware of these, and informed about the many good experiences that exist about bringing community-based natural resource management into strategies for disaster risk reduction. The picture of community-based disaster risk management can be drawn as a situation where communities with a legal, formal or customary rights, institutional-based and economic incentives can take substantial responsibility for the sustained use of local natural resources and for managing these local resources sustainably and in the long term. It's an approach where ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and community-based disaster risk reduction are integrated. It builds on local and traditional systems for management of land, water resources, fire, hazards, coastal zones. It recognizes and improves the local capacity to plan and monitor natural resource management and therefore to decrease vulnerability. So it has many reasons, community-based natural resource management, many reasons to be considered a fundamental ingredient in good disaster risk reduction planning. Management of a variety of resources, as I just mentioned, planning and monitoring of natural resource management for sustainability and livelihood security. This is essentially what this approach means. It integrates traditional and local knowledge, practices and technologies into tools for disaster risk reduction in watershed management, fire management, coastal management, forest management, agricultural practices, and so on. And so some of the values, as I just mentioned, are that it promotes recognition and use of local knowledge and practices combined with other instruments from science and technology. It opens the possibility to gather information that is useful for disaster management on existing and traditional practices. It builds local institutional capacity for engagement and for action. It empowers the communities, gives them a greater sense of responsibility and ownership and decision-making power in issues related to ecosystem-based initiatives for disaster risk reduction. It provides more confidence to the communities who instead of feeling just the passive victims of disasters can become and feel to be active players in management of such a situation. But now, how this can happen? What are some of the requirements for communities to be able to do what I just described and to play that active role in terms of reducing risk and building resilience? Well, first of all, communities need to have a minimum of security of livelihoods in relation to their rights, their entitlements related to the lands, the resources. And therefore, in any given situation, if you want to have community-based natural resource management properly integrated into strategies for disaster risk reduction, I think it is absolutely fundamental to clarify the situation of rights and entitlements of the communities in that context. You know, it's like if you own a house, or even if you rent a house but have some security of the rental, of course you will invest effort in making it stronger. You will have trees around to protect your house. But if you think that, you know, your house, you're so fragile in your rights to live in that house that you can be evicted from that tomorrow, then you will not have any incentive to invest in making it stronger against you know, hazards. So that feeling of security of your lands, your resources, the place you live in, is fundamental for people to invest in making it stronger and safer. The issue of gender roles has been, you know, quite insistently highlighted in the context of disaster risk reduction. And this needs to be understood in the context of many of the communities as they live today. Because the situation in many of these cases is that, because of many factors, there is a greater situation of vulnerability and burden for the women, particularly in poor rural communities. But at the same time, this situation of vulnerability and particular risk of the women and the burden that they have, you know, they have to take care of children, of the elderly, of all kinds of vulnerable people in a situation of disaster. This can become also a powerful tool for community resilience if women are properly empowered in terms of making decisions and in terms of having the support from broader networks. But the situation normally is that of greater vulnerability for women, which is a very serious problem in some cases. I think it is very important in planning integration of communities in disaster risk reduction to understand the situation of customary regimes for management and decision making. In the sense that customary regimes have very important advantages for mobilizing the communities, for providing support to the communities in a situation of tension and disaster. Among other reasons, because traditional systems, customary systems, have rules of authority and regulation that are absolutely fundamental in a situation of disasters. And in many cases are much more efficient than the institutional systems and regulations that are designed by governments. But the problem is that in many cases, for different factors, these customary systems are eroding, are disappearing, are being weakened, and so they may need to be revitalized and empowered to be effective actors to face change. I think the other element that is important to understand very well is cultural change. And there are many elements in cultural change, traditional knowledge, traditional practices, that if they are not properly understood, then in terms of disasters, we can miss opportunities or make wrong decisions. You know, I always remember a case where I was visiting a community in a given place in Latin America, and this community has practiced fire management for a very long time, ancient times. You know, controlled fires in different places for various reasons. But when I was visiting this community, these various communities in this area, it had become evident that fires were going out of control. And there was a lot of concern that fires were going out of control. No, and when talking to the people in the communities, the difference of perception between the young people and the elders was absolutely radical, was astonishing. For the young people, basically there was no problem, because the young people who actually practice the burning now, they had a more diversified livelihood system today. They were able to go to the city, they needed something and so on. So they didn't feel directly the impact of ecosystem degradation. For the elders, it was a very serious problem. And what they said is, you know, the problem is that these young people they have lost the knowledge that we had when we did our own traditional fire use. We used to do many things, you know, to prevent these fires from going out of control and creating big problems here. They have lost that knowledge. So good knowledge of fire management can be a tremendous asset for a community, but if that knowledge is lost, then definitely the traditional practices of that community are weakened. So understanding this cultural change, I think it is fundamental if we want to make good use for disaster preparedness and control of the traditional systems. And a similar thing for social change, like the very well known example of so many vulnerable communities who are affected today quite heavily by young male migration, which drastically changes social roles. And as you know very well, in a situation of disaster or greater risk, the social fabrics in a community affected by young male migration is absolutely different from what it was in the past. We're again, with increased burden for the women, for example, and more vulnerability, of course, for children and so on. So understanding as well how social change is playing in the communities, I think it is a fundamental condition for us to properly support the communities in good management of their resources in the context of reducing risk. So all these that I have just mentioned, all these elements that I have mentioned here, are indeed some of the important aspects of assessing community vulnerability. That's what it is. And I always insist that you know, really for properly involving communities in disaster risk reduction, the very first thing is that we need to know how to do good vulnerability assessments. And that's not just vulnerability assessments in terms of the immediate risk of a community for their food security or the water provisioning or things like that. It's also about understanding all these social factors of community vulnerability. And it's only through addressing these factors that you can actually help the communities build resilience in the long term. Because what you want is not just the communities to be able to sustain their livelihoods, you know, in the short term for the next year where they may be a disaster. You want communities who are resilient in the long term, especially knowing that there are so many places where you will have growing numbers and magnitude of disasters. We need to build, we need to help the communities build serious resilience in the long term. Resilience is impossible if all these elements and other social elements of vulnerability are not properly understood and addressed. And finally, just to show the element of governance, bringing communities into disaster risk reduction is not something that needs to focus only on the community as such and their particular local context. Their effective involvement and their effective responses and their resilience is dependent as well on the broader governance context of how decisions are made, how the planning process are developed, how much engagement exists from different stakeholders, including the communities, how much sharing of capacities and power and information exists in the communities, and therefore the institutional setup dealing with disasters needs to be as well renewed, if you want, to properly accommodate the integration of communities in that perspective. And the fact very often, as we know very well, is that disasters tend to be managed by very rigid, authoritarian, pyramidal structures. Of course, understandably in a way, because you need, you know, when you have a disaster, you need quick response and you need sometimes massive mobilization to address the impact. Whatever the case, the fact is that in the long term and for, again, building resilient societies, this pyramidal authoritarian structure that gives little room for the communities to be active players will not help, because essentially we need to share the roles and responsibilities in disaster risk management, and communities as I have said, can play a fundamental role, but a number of conditions needs to be met for that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Questions, comments, examples of some things that you're working with in your projects? Floor is open. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. In terms of this community-based natural resource management, do you think, in terms of governance, making goals and objectives, those goals and objectives should be flexible and adaptive, or we should make rigid and having contingency plan? Which one is the best, better in your opinion or your experience? Having adaptive measures or rigid measures and having contingency plans?
Well, I don't know. Probably depends on the situation, but generally, I mean, broadly, I would say, obviously, flexibility needs to be a rule. Whether the flexibility needs to be reflected at the level of objectives or have contingency, as you said, I think it depends on that, on the particularities of a context. I don't think it is one or the other necessarily. In most cases, you may need actually both. You know, to have some flexibility in the way you define your objectives and your targets, and also have some contingency plans on the side. But definitely, you know, I think that the essential rule, I would say, as I said before, is to have flexibility to be able to accommodate the diverse situation of communities, the diversity of situation, because you know, in any given context, you will have communities who are better situated than others, you know, to respond to the challenges. And for some communities, you will need to make more effort and take more time until they are ready to, you know, to meet the conditions for effective response. So having flexibility it's the key rule, but I think that there are several options in the planning processes and instruments.
Thank you. I also wanted to raise the issue of this conflict of interest between the communities. Sometimes one communities have a vested interest in the paddy fields, but in a large scale, like a city level, maybe that paddy scale should be brought back to the wetland, for instance. So I thought that this conflict of interest may be one of the issues that we have to look at when we promote this community-based ecosystem management or disaster risk reductions, because the different communities have a different interests in a different type of ecosystems. And for that, if I relate it to the area presentations, maybe water resource management also need to be linked with like a wetland or river basins, a little bigger ecosystem,
yes.
Not just restricted only to the water bodies. So I thought that may be a kind of issues we also need to keep eye on.
Absolutely. I think that's a key point, which I didn't mention, but it's absolutely a key point. When focusing on community-based natural resource management and its contribution to disaster risk reduction, one trap that one should avoid is looking at it too locally and considering rather the context, and precisely in that context take into account how conflict of interest may play and what approaches and tools you may need to use precisely to address conflict of interest. Now, an interesting fact or element in that sense is that, you know, in many places of the world, communities have part of the customary systems of communities is conflict resolution among different communities. The problem that we have today in many places is that those traditional customary systems of conflict resolution have been broken because of the intervention of the state. Traditional water management is a very good example of that. In dryland areas, for example, communities managing water in a situation of scarcity, they have had very often rules and regulations to allow for the sharing of water, avoiding conflict and it's a continuous negotiation that happens, you know, between the communities. Now the governments intervene in that situation, and they come with their own rules for allocation of water rights in a completely different way from what it was in the past. And then conflict starts to erupt. So I think it is very important to understand precisely what are the systems, traditional and modern systems for conflict resolution, that can play better in a context of empowering communities to deal with these issues. Because conflict of interest will inevitably exist, but it has to be managed. I mean, it cannot be suppressed, but it has to be managed. And it has to be managed at least to a large extent by the communities themselves, you know, through proper systems of negotiation and settlement of differences. But as I said, very often it is the intervention of the government with authoritarian rules in the context of conflict of interest among communities which creates more conflict.
That's a very crucial point, right? Communities are they're not homogenous, right? There's often conflicts within sometimes, and there's every kind of communities. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And also that in